The future is, as they say, an open book. All sorts of things can happen, and anyone who predicts with any precision, in particular, what's going to happen to economic growth, is always hedging what they say around all sorts of assumptions, models, and so on. Right now, we have a narrative that on the path of the government's ambition to be the fastest growing economy in the G7 by 2030, we have a bit of a hiatus. We have a story that Starmer and Reeves would have us believe that the reason growth is so low in the UK is because, well, it's all the fault of the Conservatives. And the reason why public finances are in a mess is, well, it's all the fault of the Conservatives. They left a black hole claimed to be about 22 billion. And once the constraints have been addressed, the government is going to open up a new era, a plan for change, a world in which by doing a sprint towards net zero in electricity in what a matter of 50, 60 months, and building 1.5 million homes, growth is going to be on a completely different order to what we've recently experienced. And that economic growth is going to solve the public expenditure problems. Why? Because more growth means more tax revenue, means that the public services, the NHS and so on, can all be paid for, because tax revenues will be just that much bigger going forward. It's a story which is repeated day in, day out, but in the face of both mounting evidence to the contrary and also due to the fundamentals of how this growth is described, modelled and accounted for. So let's think of 3 reasons why economic growth may not be quite what is forecast, even the paltry 1.1% that the IMF has proposed. One reason is, of course, inflation may turn out to be higher than anticipated. Already it's notching up in some people's forecast to around 3% plus, but to the IMF forecast, it's on the basis of their assumptions about inflation that they get to this 1.1 growth rate for this year. It's easy to confuse real and nominal, and I'm guilty of that too from time to time, but the 1.1 is at least grounded on GDP. GDP itself, though, is not really what we should be looking at when we want to know how well the economy is going to do and what the growth rate is actually going to look like. It's not hard to think of, lots and lots of reasons why GDP is a bad measure, and I'll come to some of them in a moment. But even within the terms of GDP, and even with adjustments for inflation, one way or the other, the reality is that GDP is an aggregate, and it depends on how many people there are as to how much of that cake is shared amongst us. And the fact in the UK is that population is growing, actually growing very strongly, 750,000 in the past year, and projected to be, something like that going forward. Who knows? So if, for example, GDP was forecast to be 0, GDP per head would be negative. And that's, looking back over the last year, roughly where we've got to. So we need to adjust for the number of people, the population. And in the UK's case, that population increase is driven largely by substantial and strong immigration, which has pluses and minuses, of course. The second thing that we should look at in the projections of our economic prospects going forward is debt, and in particular, public debt, and also overall aggregate national debt. So on the public debt side, the numbers are pretty scary. The borrowing has turned out to be even larger than has been anticipated in the terms in which government accounts are actually done, cash in, cash out, and we're heading for a recorded debt to GDP ratio of around 100%. That's 2-point-something trillion pounds of debt, and all at what is a higher interest rate than had previously been assumed to be the case. It's true that because the growth prospects are so low, it's likely that nominal interest rates will come down a bit this year, maybe several times. But what's going on in the bond market tells you a completely different story. It tells you that the long bond rate, particularly adjusted for inflation, has gone up. There's no sign it's going to return to the kinds of levels we saw in the period of 1990 through to 2020. On the contrary, it may actually get worse from the point of view of funding and paying the interest on the current stock of debt. And it's so big already that it ranks about number 3 amongst the items of public expenditure, with welfare way out ahead, and then the NHS, and then we're into debt interest. It's a burden on all of us, and it's hard to see what it is we've got for that debt, which compensates us with greater assets, better performance, etc., which gives us the wherewithal and ability to pay that interest. If we think about 2-point-something trillion as a borrowing proposition, it's a lousy deal because we haven't got very much for that 2-point-something. Indeed, historically, it's been built up from the financial crash, from the COVID events, but also paying for day-to-day expenditure, which ought to be coming out of our income directly. But even this is to understate the seriousness of the problem, because what subsequent governments have done, right back from actually before the financial crisis earlier in this century, is that they've been trying to shift as much of the costs that fall upon government onto the private sector, get them off the government's balance sheet, and then pretend we're better off. So take a look at all that borrowing in the privatised utilities and ask yourself, what would the accounts have looked like if we'd have been still in a nationalised industry world? That debt would have been on the government's balance sheet, not privatised onto private balance sheets. But from the national perspective overarching all of this, of course, you should add the two sets of debt together. And if you add the two sets together, then you get well beyond 100% debt to GDP. So the debt position is unsustainable. And the fiscal rules which the Chancellor advances and promises to keep to the extent that they really are very serious rules at all, won't get us out of this particular difficulty. On the contrary, it'll encourage governments to carry on privatising as much public debt as they possibly can. And wait for it, we expect to see another version of the PFI schemes coming pretty shortly. So the overall GDP per head is pretty weak. It might be as high as 1%, but actually it's probably below that. The debt position eating away at our growth rate in the future because it eats away at the resources available for investing and doing productive stuff is getting worse underneath. And then we say, well, what about the policies that are supposed to be sorting all this out? Well, take a look at the autumn budget. It's pretty hard to think of a set of measures you could take which could do more damage to the economic growth outlook. What the autumn budget did was to increase the tax on labour, therefore increase the costs of labour. It had unfunded public expenditure, which increased the cost of capital, just like Liz Truss had unfunded tax cuts, again with the reaction in the bond market. So up has gone the cost of labour and up has gone the cost of capital. And then to make things even worse, the other tax increases are on savings. And bearing in mind that net of capital depreciation, this country has very little savings, it makes us ever more dependent on foreigners to lend us the money to effectively live beyond our means. For those three reasons, things are probably worse than the apparent 1% or so that is projected forward by the IMF for the UK economy. My guess is that lot takes us to naught or below naught. Now, you might think, well, that's pretty bad, but, there's plenty of possible upsides that may come along, and there may be, and I hope there are. But unfortunately, this isn't the true extent of what is going on in respect of economic growth and the state of the British economy. Because the really big adjustment to make is to set out what's happened to the government's balance sheet and the damage that's being done to it by essentially consuming our capital. What do I mean by that? Well, you can see it every day if you drive a car and you hit a pothole, that we're not maintaining the roads. This is just a small example of a much bigger phenomenon. We are not doing capital maintenance properly in our economy, and worse, we're calling capital maintenance investment. It isn't. It's just mending the state of things as they are. And capital maintenance should be paid for out of current income, and then what's left as a result of deducting that capital maintenance from the tax and other revenues that are coming into government is what's left for the other bits of public expenditure, health, welfare, and all the other bits and pieces. Do that calculation, and what you realise is that to maintain what is effectively the fiction of 1% growth or 0% growth going forward in GDP terms, we're actually eating up our capital stock. If you like, we are effectively getting rid of the family silver as we go along. And you can see it all around us. It doesn't work. Stuff doesn't happen. Core infrastructure isn't fit for purpose. And that's really what matters for the future possibilities of economic growth. So will building lots of houses solve the problem? No. Will it make some difference? Yes, of course, but not that much. And let's see how and in what form that rolls forward and at what cost. And then what about the sprint to net zero? It's pretty hard to think of a more expensive way of transforming an electricity system in such short order when the supply chains are almost entirely foreign and where other people are trying to do similar things. If you want all the kit now, well, you have to pay top dollar, and we certainly are, and it's very unlikely that this is going to be properly coordinated to get us away from what is the highest industrial energy prices across the developed world. Just blaming on gas doesn't cut the mustard. Why? Well, the gas price has fallen a lot and the electricity price hasn't. Gas prices are now back in real terms to their 5 and 10-year averages in the European markets. Blaming on foreign markets requires you to explain how in foreign markets the price can fall so substantially and that the electricity prices don't follow. So that's not going to cut the mustard either. And remember, what's really going on in the electricity infrastructure space and the net zero program is essentially capital maintenance. What the government, in calling all this lot investment, is doing is engaging in the so-called broken glass fallacy. You smash the windows, get rid of all the dirty fossil fuel stuff, and replace the windows with renewables. The windows are the same. It's the output of electricity that's being consumed. It isn't actually new investment. It's replacement investment, and that should come out of current revenue, not be claimed against debt, primarily owed to foreigners, that future generations should pay back. So add this together, and the economic clouds are dark, indeed seriously dark. And they're sufficiently dark to give us one upside. It's now increasingly obvious that more sticky plasters are not going to crack the problem. And therefore, a fundamental rethink is required to put us on a sustainable economic growth path, a sustainable consumption path, and to set the economy up in a way that we live within our means rather than live without and keep dumping more and more debt on future generations. Thank you.